From the outside, it all looked perfect. Malik Faraz Al-Zahran was the kind of man whose presence seemed rehearsed for power. Impeccable suits, calm posture, and an air of someone raised to never falter. But beneath the surface, everything was pressure. He was 31 and had never once made a decision that hadn't been dictated by someone else. He wasn't raised as a boy. He was molded as a symbol, heir to one of the oldest royal families in the Middle East, born to carry the weight of legacy on his back. That morning started just like many others inside the stone walls of the palace. Silent corridors, clipped greetings, and a breakfast he barely touched. But today wasn't like any other day. Today was the day he would be sent to America. Not for leisure, not for freedom, but for duty. His father's voice still echoed from the night before. Close the deals, represent the name, and return ready to marry. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Malik had nodded out of habit, but inside, something had started to crack. He wasn't a teenager anymore, yet in that palace he always felt 12. And this time, as he boarded the jet, his hands didn't just hold a passport, they held the burden of a life he never chose. The arrival in New York felt surreal. The city buzzed with a kind of chaos Malik wasn't used to. Cars honking, voices overlapping, strangers brushing past with urgency. He walked through the terminal with the practiced indifference of someone trained to observe, not absorb. Every move was measured, every breath filtered through purpose. He was there to finalize the expansion of the Al-Zahran Group's operations, sign deals, shake hands, and return to Darkash with results. That was the plan. But plans don't account for collisions. She wasn't supposed to be there. No one was. Yet she was. Sitting alone in the departure lounge in a red dress that didn't scream for attention, but held it all the same. She wasn't scrolling through a phone. She wasn't pretending to be busy. She was just there, reading, like the rest of the world didn't exist. When her eyes lifted from the page and locked with his, Malik felt something strange. Not a spark, not fireworks, just a pause, a silence in the middle of noise. It lasted seconds, maybe less. She looked away, stood up, and disappeared into the moving crowd without a word. But something in him stirred, something that didn't feel like responsibility or lineage or legacy, something that felt like curiosity. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough to make him feel alive. He tried to brush it off, told himself it was nothing, just a momentary distraction, fleeting, inconsequential. But a few hours later, fate seemed to disagree. Malik had checked into his hotel, one of those discreet five-star places where everything looked expensive but no one asked questions. He needed caffeine and solitude, so he made his way to the cafe tucked in the corner of the lobby. The space was quiet, dimly lit, filled with the scent of strong coffee and polished wood. He ordered an espresso and waited, elbows on the counter, eyes on the floor, and then the door chimed behind him and she walked in. Same woman, same red dress, same unreadable calm on her face. She didn't notice him right away. At least, she didn't show it. She ordered quickly and stood a few feet away from him, waiting for her drink. It could have ended there. Two strangers crossing paths again by coincidence. But the barista called their numbers at the exact same time. They stepped forward together and their hands brushed. Just for a second, just enough to shift something. "Sorry," she said with a quick smile. He responded in English, accent thick but words clear. "My fault." She studied him then, head tilted slightly. "You're not from here," she said. "I'm not," he replied. "And you? Do you often show up twice in the same day for the same stranger?" Her lips curled in a half smile. Maybe fate's bored. And just like that, she turned to leave. But this time, Malik didn't let the moment pass. "Are you going to disappear again?" he called out. She paused at the door, looked over her shoulder. "Only if you let me." And then she was gone again, leaving him with a heart pounding harder than it had in years. He wasn't impulsive by nature. His life had been built on control, on restraint, on calculated moves. But that night, he found himself wandering the streets of Manhattan without a destination. The city was loud and alive. Street performers playing violins near subway grates, vendors yelling over each other, neon lights reflecting off puddles from an earlier rain. Malik walked like a man possessed, unsure of what he was looking for, only knowing he couldn't sit still. And then, as if pulled by some invisible thread, he saw her again. This time she wore black, sleek, understated, dangerous. Her silhouette moved with quiet confidence, weaving through the crowd like she belonged to it, and yet didn't. She hadn't seen him yet. He watched for a beat longer than he should have, then closed the distance. "You have a habit of showing up when I'm least ready," he said, stopping beside her. She looked up, surprised, but not startled. "And you have a habit of walking alone at night. Doesn't seem safe." He smiled, a real one this time. "Maybe I have good memory." She raised an eyebrow. "You already used that line. Only with you." That made her laugh. A soft, genuine sound that made the noise of the city fade a little. "You're better at this than I thought." "At what?" he asked, pretending to be casual when you're clearly invested. Malik didn't deny it. He didn't need to, not when his eyes had already said too much. They didn't plan dinner. It just happened. One second they were standing under the city lights exchanging words that danced between curiosity and challenge, and the next they were walking side by side into a quiet little restaurant tucked between a laundromat and a jazz bar. The place was dim, cozy, with exposed brick walls and candles flickering gently on every table. Malik chose a spot near the window, not out of romance but habit, always needing to see the exits, the room, the people. She sat across from him, chin resting lightly in one hand, eyes scanning his face as if she were reading between lines that hadn't been spoken yet. "Do you usually eat with strangers?" she asked, tracing the rim of her wine glass. "Only when they're impossible to ignore," he replied. She smirked, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was something in her, a tension, a guarded edge that softened in her smile, but never left entirely. He wanted to ask questions about her life, her quiet confidence. But instead, he asked the one thing he couldn't stop thinking about. "Why were you reading at the airport?" She blinked, like no one had asked her that before. "Because it's easier to disappear in a story than in a crowd." He leaned in slightly. "And what are you running from?" She didn't answer immediately, just looked at him for a long second. "Myself," she said finally. The words hit him harder than they should have, because in that moment he realized they weren't so different. The car ride after dinner was filled with that kind of silence that says more than small talk ever could. She sat with her face turned to the window, fingers loosely intertwined in her lap. Malik drove slowly, not wanting the night to end, but also unsure of what came next. The city outside blurred into streaks of light and color. At a red light, she turned toward him. "Are you going to kiss me, or keep pretending you're not thinking about it?" Her voice was calm, but her eyes challenged him. Malik didn't speak. He just reached over and gently cradled her face, pulling her in without hesitation. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, testing. Then it deepened, urgent and raw, like it had been waiting inside him for years. She didn't pull away. Her hands found his shoulders, then his neck, and he felt her body soften under his touch. There was no one else, no rules, no crown. Just this moment, this woman, and the inexplicable feeling that she might be the only real thing in a life built on expectations. When the kiss broke, she whispered, "This shouldn't be happening." He nodded, but didn't let go. "It is." She exhaled sharply, pulled herself together and said, "Let me out here." He frowned. "You haven't told me where you live." She was already opening the door. "And I won't." And just like that, she vanished into the night again, leaving Malik breathless, confused, and burning with something he hadn't felt in a long time, desire without control. He didn't sleep that night. The hotel room felt colder than it was, and every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was her walking away. It wasn't just about attraction. Malik had been with women before, but this was different. She hadn't given him her name, and somehow that made everything more real. There were no masks between them, only raw presence. The next morning came too quickly, and Malik moved through it like a ghost. Meetings, handshakes, contracts, all of it passed in a blur. Everyone around him seemed impressed, congratulating him on another successful negotiation. But inside, he was distracted, haunted even. Around midday, he returned to the hotel, hoping for a moment of quiet. Instead, he found her. There she was, standing in the hallway outside a door just a few rooms down from his, fumbling with a hotel key card. Same posture, same hair, but a completely different energy now, tense, focused. She looked up and their eyes met. "You again," he said, his voice quieter than he expected. She hesitated, card in hand. "Seems like we're neighbors." He walked to his door, paused. 11:07, he said. She glanced at her own. 11:09. She smiled, just a little. Destiny's sense of humor is pretty specific. He should have said more, but instead he unlocked his door, stepped inside, and let the door close. But even with the room silent around him, her presence didn't fade. It didn't end there. That night, something pulled him back out into the corridor. Maybe he hoped to bump into her again. Maybe he just needed air. But he found himself knocking on her door. 3 short taps. When she opened it, her expression didn't match surprise. It matched something else. Resignation. Like she had been waiting. She wore a light robe, her hair loose over her shoulders. No makeup, no pretense. "This is your 4th time finding me," she said softly. "Maybe I stopped trying not to," he replied. She stepped aside, letting him in without a word. The room was quiet, almost identical to his, but the air felt different, denser, fuller. She walked to the window and looked out, arms crossed. "There's something wrong with this," she said. He stood behind her, close but not touching. "Because it's easy?" She turned. "Because it feels too much like fate. And fate always has a price." He didn't answer, just watched her. Watched the way her eyes moved, the way she fidgeted with the robe's belt, the way her chest rose and fell like she was holding something in. "Do you want me here?" he asked. Her response was immediate, barely above a whisper. "Yes." That was all it took. He stepped forward, took her hand, and the space between them collapsed. The kiss was slower this time, deeper, like they were trying to memorize it. And when the robe slid off her shoulders, when they found the bed, it wasn't about lust anymore. It was about recognition, like their bodies already knew each other, even if their minds hadn't caught up yet. They didn't speak after, just held each other in the dark, breathing in sync, as if afraid to wake up and realize it wasn't real. He woke up just before sunrise, the city still cloaked in that early morning haze, where everything feels quieter than it should. The warmth of her body still lingered beside him, but the space was empty. He sat up, the sheet sliding down his chest, and glanced around. Her dress was gone, her shoes, her scent, faint but undeniable, still hung in the air like a final whisper. Malik rubbed his face, trying to make sense of what he felt. Anger didn't quite fit. Neither did sadness. It was something more complex, something that made his chest ache. He got out of bed, checked the bathroom. Nothing. He checked the hallway. No trace. It was like she'd vanished. And maybe that was her thing, appearing and disappearing like a ghost, dressed in silk and secrets. But then he noticed the mark on the sheet. Small, red, stark against the white cotton. He stared at it longer than he should have. She hadn't lied. That night had been her first, and she'd given it to him like it meant something, like he was more than just a stranger with a powerful last name. That realization didn't bring comfort. It brought weight, the kind of weight that crushes if you try to carry it alone. Still half-dressed and barely awake, Malik went downstairs. The receptionist greeted him with the kind of neutral cheerfulness that only made him feel more disconnected. "Good morning, sir." He didn't waste time. "The woman in room 1109. Did she check out?" The man typed into the system, nodded. "Yes, sir. Around 6 a.m. Malik's voice was quiet but firm. "Did she leave anything? A note? A message?" The receptionist shook his head. "No, sir. Everything was prepaid. The reservation was under an international name. No local information provided." Malik nodded slowly, but his mind was spinning. She had planned it. Every step. The vanish, the clean break, the lack of digital traces. It all fit. But what didn't fit was how real it felt. He wasn't some naive boy who mistook a night of passion for something more. But this hadn't been ordinary, and the fact that she had slipped away so smoothly only made it worse. He went back up to his room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. For a long time, he didn't move. Just sat there, elbows on knees, staring at the same mark on the sheets, wondering what the hell just happened and why he felt like he'd lost something he never really had. The day dragged by in fragments. Malik tried to get back to work, meetings, contracts, polite nods, but everything felt hollow. He was a man who had spent his entire life executing plans with precision, yet now, the absence of one unnamed woman had unraveled him. He couldn't stop replaying the night. Her touch, her hesitation, her silence, the way she had looked at him like he was something more than a symbol. He hadn't asked for this. He didn't have time for this, and yet here he was, scrolling through security footage requests that were immediately denied, calling the front desk under false pretenses, and asking the driver if she'd requested a car. Nothing. No trail. No leads. It was like chasing vapor. At one point, he even considered calling the palace for advice, but what would he say? That he was losing his mind over a woman he didn't even know the full name of? That he felt more shaken from one night with her than a decade of political obligations? No, he couldn't do that. So instead, he buried himself in work. He forced himself to read spreadsheets, analyze market trends, review property deals. But it didn't matter. She was still there, in his mind, in the weight behind his eyes, in the tightness in his chest. Everything else had become background noise. By the second night, Malik had stopped pretending. He wandered the city again, retracing steps without really knowing why. Every cafe reminded him of her. Every quiet street corner echoed the way her voice had sounded just before she said goodbye. He found himself back at the same coffee shop where they'd brushed hands, ordered the same drink, sat in the same seat, and waited. But she didn't come. At some point he realized how foolish it looked. This man in a tailored coat, staring at the entrance like a heartbroken teenager. Still, he didn't leave right away. He sat there long after the espresso went cold, long after the barista stopped checking on him. He left only when the silence became too loud to ignore. Back at the hotel, he tossed his keys on the table and dropped into bed, face to the side where she had once been. The sheets no longer smelled like her, but his memory filled in the gaps. He could still hear her breath against his neck, still feel the press of her hand on his chest, and somewhere between longing and anger, he finally understood. This wasn't about losing her. It was about what she made him feel, and what she awakened inside him couldn't be undone by disappearing. The next 2 days passed like a film on mute. Malik spoke only when necessary. He canceled one dinner, postponed another meeting, and gave automated responses that made even his assistant notice something was off. But no one asked. No one dared. In their eyes, he was the prince, stoic, polished, focused. Inside, he was unraveling. Not from heartbreak, but from confusion, from the weight of something unfinished. The palace called on the second evening. His father's voice came through the line as sharp as ever. "It's time," Harun said. "You've been away long enough." Malik didn't argue. "I still have deals pending," he said instead. "They're signed. The contracts are closed. Your duty here is done." There was a pause. "The wedding is in 3 weeks. You're expected." Malik clenched his jaw, eyes fixed on the skyline outside his hotel window. "I need more time." The line went silent, then dead. No warning, no goodbye. That was how things worked with his father. Obedience was assumed. Resistance was punished with silence colder than exile. Malik sat in that silence for hours after, phone still in his hand, wondering what the hell he was returning to, and why, even with all his reasons, the thought of going back felt more like surrender than homecoming. The private jet was already fueled and waiting when Malik arrived at the hangar. The sun hadn't even risen yet, and the air carried that pre-dawn chill that seemed to echo everything he didn't say aloud. He boarded without a word, coffee in hand, suitcase in tow, and took his seat by the window. As the engines hummed to life, he stared out across the tarmac, watching as a woman walked across the far end of the terminal. For a second, just a second, he thought it was her. His breath caught in his throat. Same posture, same stride, same dark waves of hair. But when she turned, his heart sank. It wasn't. Of course it wasn't. The woman disappeared into the crowd, unaware of the storm she'd just awakened. Malik leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly, the thud of his heart still out of sync with reality. That was the moment he realized it. Soraya wasn't just someone he met. She had imprinted on him. And no matter how many borders he crossed or how many titles he held, she was inside him now, in his memory, in his blood. And he hated that, not because it was weak, but because it was real. The plane lifted off, and he watched the skyline vanish beneath him, swallowed by clouds. The farther he got from her, the more certain he became. He was never going to forget. Dark ash welcomed him back like a mausoleum dressed in gold. The sun was high when Malik stepped off the jet, but the air felt colder than it should have. 2 guards and a royal aide greeted him with rehearsed bows and formalities. "Welcome home, Your Highness," one of them said. Malik gave a small nod, but inside the word home landed wrong. Nothing about this place felt like home anymore. Not the carved archways, not the incense-scented halls, not the wide stone corridors echoing with footsteps that weren't his. It all felt staged. He was escorted directly to the palace where a private dinner with his father awaited, like some sort of final reminder. This is your path, whether you like it or not. Malik dressed in ceremonial robes, gold trim pressed to perfection, but every thread felt like a chain. He walked the length of the corridor with a calm exterior, even though his thoughts were circling like vultures. The engagement ceremony was fast approaching, and he was expected to meet his betrothed, some noblewoman chosen not for love, but for diplomacy. He wasn't even curious. He didn't care. Nothing had mattered since she left. He didn't want to compare. He didn't want to hope. But as he approached the doors to the ceremonial hall, that same quiet dread returned, like he was about to witness something he wasn't prepared for. The room was lavish, as expected. Crystal chandeliers hung low, long tables lined with traditional delicacies, and a half-dozen officials whispering about lineage and power dynamics. Malik stood still, expression neutral, body tense. His father sat at the center, nodding slightly. "She's arriving," he said. Malik didn't respond. He didn't need to. He was here. He was performing. And that was enough, for now. A hush fell over the room as two women entered, both in formal attire, one older and likely an attendant. The other wore a traditional dress, deep gold embroidered with silver thread, and a veil that covered her face entirely. She walked slowly, posture straight, steps measured. Malik's eyes stayed on the floor, unfocused, detached. He barely heard the ceremonial words being spoken, barely registered his name being recited alongside hers. "You may lift the veil," the king finally said. She reached up with graceful fingers, and the moment her face was revealed, the world dropped out from under him. It was her, the woman who haunted his thoughts, the one who vanished without a name, standing before him now with a new identity, a different name, and the same eyes that had looked into his soul. He felt his pulse hammer in his ears. "You," he said, without realizing the word had left his lips. She met his gaze, calm but tight with emotion. "I'm Lyon," she said softly. But Malik only heard one name, Soraya, and everything inside him fractured. The silence that followed wasn't ceremonial. It was suffocating. Malik didn't hear the whispers or the shifting of chairs or even his father's voice calling his name. He only saw her face, the way her chin held firm while her eyes betrayed everything she didn't say. Memories hit him like a flood. The red dress, the weight of her body on his, the sound of her breath in the dark, the emptiness she left behind. And now she was standing in front of him with another name, wrapped in tradition, positioned like a pawn in a game he didn't even want to play. His chest tightened. "You lied to me," he said, low enough for only her to hear. She shook her head slightly. "I never lied. I just didn't tell you everything." The king frowned from his seat. "Is there a problem, Malik?" he asked sharply. Malik's voice caught in his throat. He couldn't answer. He didn't even know what this was. Fate? Betrayal? A cosmic joke? She stood perfectly still, as if knowing any movement would shatter the fragile illusion of calm holding the room together. "Don't hate me," she whispered, her voice trembling now. "Not before you know why." But Malik couldn't think straight, couldn't breathe right. The woman he had spent days searching for, aching over, was the same one now tied to his future by bloodlines and politics. It felt like the cruelest magic, and he was its unwilling audience. The ceremony concluded as if nothing had happened. Speeches were made, hands were shaken, wine was poured. But Malik didn't speak another word. He sat through it like a statue, his face carved into a mask of royal composure while inside, everything was burning. His father gave him a curt nod of approval. Advisors whispered about upcoming dates and guest lists. Meanwhile, Malik's mind was spinning with one question: why? After everyone else had filed out and the palace halls fell quiet again, he went looking for her. Not in the public rooms or along the corridors, but in the private wing where the guests were housed. He knocked, sharp, loud, no hesitation. The door opened slowly, and there she was again. No veil, no gold, just her, Soraya. Her robe was simple, her face clean of makeup, but her eyes were the same, haunted. She stepped back, letting him in without a word. He entered like a storm, fast, heavy, and without grace. "Why?" he asked, voice raw. "Why did you disappear? Why did you let me believe you were just some passing stranger?" She looked down. "Because I was afraid." He laughed, short and bitter. "Of me? Of myself," she said. "Of what I felt. Of what I knew I'd have to become once you found out who I really was." Her words hung in the air, suspended between confession and consequence. Malik didn't know whether to scream or reach for her, so he did neither. He just stared, because that was the only thing that still made sense. She didn't try to justify herself with elaborate excuses. She didn't cry or beg or make dramatic proclamations. She just stood there, silent, steady, vulnerable in the simplest way. Malik's fists clenched at his sides. "You let me wake up alone," he said, his voice low and sharp. "You vanished without a name, without a trace, and now you stand in front of me as my betrothed like it was all a game." Her eyes filled, but her voice stayed even. "I didn't know it was you, Malik. Not at first. When I was told I would meet the Prince of Darkash, I had no idea it was the man I had already." She stopped herself, bit her lip, looked away. "When I saw you in that room, I panicked. Everything I had buried came back at once. I didn't leave because it meant nothing. I left because it meant too much." He paced, trying to catch his breath, trying to steady the fury that was equally heartbreak. "You should have told me the truth." "I was going to," she whispered. "Eventually. But every time I thought I could, I was afraid it would ruin what we had." He turned to face her. "And what did we have, Soraya? A lie?" She looked up finally, eyes fierce through the pain. "No. We had the only real thing I've ever known. That's what terrifies me." For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them pulsed with every word left unsaid. Malik's breathing slowed, but his heart still thundered. He had rehearsed so many versions of what he'd say if he ever saw her again. Accusations, closure, control. None of those scripts worked now. He stepped closer. "I hated you," he confessed, his voice breaking slightly. "I hated you for making me feel like I was worth something, and then leaving me with nothing." Her lip trembled, but she didn't speak. Instead, she stepped forward until only inches separated them. "Then tell me what to do now," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. "Tell me how to fix it." Malik looked at her for a long time. He didn't see a princess. He didn't see a liar. He saw the same woman who had trembled beneath his touch and whispered that she had never been with anyone before. The woman who had looked at him without fear, only truth. He reached out, cupped her jaw gently, tilted her chin toward him. "You can't fix it," he said almost sadly, "but maybe we don't need to." And before either of them could second-guess it, he kissed her. Not like before, not out of hunger or heat, but out of desperation, out of hope, out of something raw and reckless that neither of them could name but both recognized. Her hands gripped his sleeves, his body pulled her closer, and in that kiss was every wound and every wish tangled into one. The kiss didn't fix what was broken, but it said what words couldn't. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads stayed touching, breathing each other in like they were the only safe place left. Soraya's voice came out in a whisper. "I don't want this to be a mistake." Malik swallowed hard. "Neither do I." But even as he said it, doubt hovered behind his eyes. The palace, the expectations, the political machine behind their engagement, it was all still real. And this fragile, complicated bond between them wasn't built for those halls. "They'll never accept this," he muttered. "Not like this." She looked at him, really looked. "So what do we do?" He stepped back, rubbing his hand over his face. "I need time," he said. She nodded, though he could see the flicker of hurt flash through her expression. "Take what you need," she replied. And she meant it, because despite everything, her lies, her silence, she still wanted to be chosen. Not because of duty, but because of feeling. Malik hesitated at the door. "I don't know what's real anymore," he admitted. Her reply came softly, without anger. "Then start with this. How I look at you when no one else is watching." He didn't turn back, but he carried those words with him down every hallway after. The palace shifted overnight. There were no formal announcements, no gossip from servants. But something in the air changed. Malik and Soraya moved like shadows, passing each other in silence, each glance more loaded than the last. The physical closeness of being under the same roof only heightened the emotional distance. He couldn't forget the pain of her disappearance. She couldn't ignore the guilt of withholding the truth. And somewhere between love and resentment, they lost their footing again. The next few days were a blur of tradition. Dress fittings, ceremonial rehearsals, dinners full of stiff smiles and scripted pleasantries. Malik endured it all, but his heart wasn't in it. His mind kept drifting back to her. How she breathed when she was asleep. How she whispered, "Don't stop," when she finally let him in. But more than that, he kept seeing the fear in her eyes when she revealed herself as Leon. It wasn't the fear of being caught. It was the fear of losing the one thing she hadn't expected to find: him. One evening, while the courtyard was quiet and the sky painted in shades of dusk, he saw her again. She was barefoot, wearing a simple white dress, walking along the edge of the fountain like it was the only place she could breathe. Malik watched from the shadows for a moment before stepping into the light. "You're not running tonight," he said. She turned, surprised but calm. "Not yet," she replied. And just like that, the weight between them began to shift. Slowly, silently, but unmistakably. He walked toward her, each step deliberate, like he was crossing some invisible line between past and present. She stood still by the fountain, the sound of water filling the space between their breaths. "I thought you might leave," he said. She shook her head, looking out at the garden instead of him. "I wanted to, 100 times, but I couldn't." He stopped a few feet away. "Why not?" Her shoulders rose and fell. "Because I was tired of disappearing, and because you make me want to be seen." Malik let the words settle. They didn't erase the confusion, but they carved out a new kind of clarity. "I've spent my life doing what was expected, what was demanded. And then you showed up and ruined all of that." She looked at him now, not afraid. Then maybe it needed to be ruined. The moonlight caught the edge of her profile, and he felt something shift, some invisible guard in him breaking down. "You scare me," he confessed. "You make me question everything I thought I had figured out." She stepped closer, so close he could feel her warmth. "And you make me believe that maybe I'm not too broken to love." They didn't kiss. They didn't touch. But in that stillness, something between them healed, just a little. The palace moved around them as if nothing had changed. Courtiers continued their rituals. Servants bowed and avoided eye contact. The king remained stone-faced, issuing orders and finalizing preparations for the engagement celebration. But under the surface, Malik was no longer passive. He started asking questions about her, quietly, carefully. He pulled records, called in a favor from Fatih, the one advisor who had always stood by him without question. "I want to know who she really is," he said. "Before all this, before the veil and the title." Fatih didn't ask why. He nodded and returned 2 days later with a thin, leather-bound folder. Malik opened it in his private chamber, and the truth hit like a slow-moving blade. Her real name was Soraya Nadia Al-Karim. No official date of birth, no family recorded. Raised in a foreign-funded orphanage near the southwestern border, reassigned to a European finishing school in her teens. Fluent in multiple languages, trained in diplomacy. But what struck him most was the note at the bottom of the last page. Used a false identity in the US, likely for personal protection. Malik closed the folder slowly, fingers pressing into the leather. It wasn't deception. It was survival. And suddenly, everything made more sense. Her distance, her silence, her shame. She hadn't lied to manipulate him. She had hidden to protect herself. And when she told him her real name that night in the hotel room, it wasn't part of the game. It was a confession, maybe even a gift. That night, Malik found himself walking the halls of the palace without purpose. His footsteps echoed softly against the marble, familiar corridors now feeling foreign. Eventually, they carried him to the East Terrace, a place usually abandoned at that hour. But someone was already there. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around herself, hair loose and tangled by the wind. When she turned and saw him, her body stiffened. "Did Fatih tell you?" she asked before he could speak. "I found out on my own," he said quietly. "He brought me the truth." She nodded slowly, then looked away. "So, what happens now?" Malik approached her slowly and sat beside her, the stone cool beneath them. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Not an explanation, not forgiveness, not even your story." She shook her head. "But I want to tell it, because I've spent my life running from it." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "I was born in the borderlands, raised in an orphanage where girls like me were lucky if they survived past adolescence. When I turned 15, I was sent to a private school in Belgium, paid for by an anonymous donor. They taught me everything: how to speak, how to sit, how to lie without getting caught. I didn't even know who I was until I found a letter hidden among my mother's belongings. It said my father was someone the royal family had tried to erase. She paused, searching his face. "Do you believe me?" Malik didn't flinch. "I don't know what to believe, but I know what I feel." She let out a shaky breath and leaned her head back against the stone railing. "My father was considered a traitor," she said. "He tried to change things, dismantle the class system, end the arranged marriages, break the chains of bloodlines. He failed, and my mother paid the price. She died giving birth to me, and her final request was that I be hidden from everything. So I lived as a ghost, a name with no history, a girl with no future." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "When I came here under a new name, I didn't think anyone would see me. And then you did." Malik turned toward her, his own expression unreadable. "You told me your real name that night," he said. "In that room you said, Soraya." She nodded. "Because it was the first time I wanted someone to know me, really know me." Silence stretched between them again, but this time it was softer, less suffocating. "You're not a threat to me," Malik finally said, "but I had to understand the storm you came from before I could stand in it with you." She looked at him then, her defenses down completely. "And now that you do?" Malik hesitated. "Now, I have to decide whether I walk away from everything I've ever known, or if I fight for something that no one else understands." She reached for his hand without thinking. He let her, and for the first time since their world collided, there was peace between them. Fragile, but real. The following days passed in a strange rhythm. The palace prepared for the engagement ceremony with the kind of efficiency only tradition could fuel. Tailors worked through the night, calligraphers printed invitations on embossed parchment, and the royal kitchens tested every dish a dozen times. But none of that mattered to Malik anymore. His thoughts were consumed by something else entirely. The night on the terrace had changed everything. Soraya wasn't just a woman with a hidden past. She was the embodiment of every conflict he'd tried to suppress his entire life. She wasn't here by coincidence. She was the test he didn't know he'd been training for. And yet, even knowing her story, even seeing the pain she'd carried silently, he still didn't have the answer. Until the summons came. His father wanted a private audience. No advisors, no distractions. Malik walked into the council chamber with shoulders squared, jaw tight. The king was already seated at the long table, fingers steepled, expression unreadable. "There's too much speculation," Harun said. "Your hesitation is turning heads. We cannot afford to look divided." Malik stood in silence. "You will proceed with the ceremony," his father continued, "or you will step aside. There is no in-between." The air between them felt thick. Malik's hands curled into fists at his sides. "And if I choose neither?" The king's voice didn't change. "Then you renounce your title. You leave this place, this name, and this family behind." Malik felt the words land like stones, not because of what he'd lose, but because he'd finally realized what he was willing to risk everything for. He left the chamber without another word. Outside, the palace halls were filled with preparations, but all Malik could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. He needed space, air, time to breathe, but there was none. When he returned to his quarters, she was already there. Soraya sat by the window, knees pulled up, her body framed by the soft light of a fading afternoon. Her face was calm, but her eyes betrayed the same restlessness he felt in his own bones. "They told me," she said, voice low, "that you have until sunrise to decide." He nodded, slowly removing the ring from his finger and placing it on the table. "It's all crashing down," he murmured, "and I don't even know if I'm supposed to stop it or let it fall." She stood, moved to him without hesitation. "I don't want to be the reason you walk away from everything." He looked at her, really looked. "You're not the reason. You're the truth I've been avoiding." She touched his chest, right where his heart beat. "Then what do you want, Malik?" He didn't answer right away, just stood there, breathing her in. "I want to stop performing," he whispered. "I want to live." She stepped back just slightly. "And if I'm the price for that life?" His reply was immediate. "Then you're not a price. You're the beginning." Her eyes watered and she nodded. "Then let's stop running." But neither of them moved, because some beginnings demand stillness first, before the leap. Dawn came faster than either of them expected. The palace, already awake with ceremony, moved like a machine. Servants preparing garments, guards forming lines, advisors rehearsing scripts. But Malik stood alone on the highest terrace, the wind tugging at his robe, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon. Below, the city stirred. Above, the sky shifted from indigo to gold. And within him, something finally clicked into place. He didn't belong to these walls. He never had. He belonged to the truth he'd found in her eyes. The noise from below, the drums, the horns, the rehearsed declarations, grew louder, calling him to a life he never chose. Behind him, the door opened. He didn't turn. "You came," he said softly. Soraya stepped beside him, dressed simply in white. No veil, no gold, just herself. "I wasn't sure I should," she admitted. He looked at her then, his voice steady. "Neither was I." A beat passed. "But if I have to make the hardest decision of my life, I want to do it looking at what's real." She reached for his hand, and he let her take it. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "No," he said, "but I'm done being afraid of not being sure." Below them, the ceremonial doors opened. The people waited. The crown sat on a velvet cushion. Malik took one last breath, squeezed her hand, and stepped forward, not toward the throne, but toward the edge of everything that had defined him. The gasp echoed through the grand hall when the crowd looked up. Malik stood above them, robe unfastened, hair tousled by the wind. No guards, no crown. And beside him, her, not the adorned fiancée they were promised, but the woman with no lineage, no approval, and no explanation. "I won't be taking the throne," Malik's voice rang out, firm, clear. "I won't accept a legacy that demands I bury who I am." Murmurs broke out like waves crashing. The king stood, fury barely contained. But Malik didn't waver. "This woman," he said, turning to Soraya, "saw me before I even knew who I was. And with her, I choose truth, not tradition. I choose a life where I don't have to hide my heart." The uproar grew louder, but Malik reached for her hand again, grounding them both. "Let them talk," he said to her, his voice soft now. "Let them rage." And then, in front of the entire court, he kissed her. No ceremony, no permission, just a man claiming the life he wanted. When they pulled apart, she whispered, "Are you ready for the storm?" He smiled, tears in his eyes. "It already passed the moment I chose you." Together they turned and walked down the stone steps, not knowing what the world would look like outside, but knowing they'd face it side by side. For once, Malik didn't feel like he was running. He felt like he was free. They left without a destination, only the will to begin again. Days later, they found a quiet village tucked between cliffs and coastline, where the air smelled of sea salt and fresh bread. It wasn't royal, it wasn't impressive, but it was real. Malik rented a modest home, a whitewashed cottage with wooden shutters and creaky floors. No guards, no protocol, no expectations. Soraya unpacked slowly, her fingers lingering on each folded shirt like she was learning to breathe in this new life. Malik watched her, unsure if he'd ever get used to the stillness. There were no meetings to attend, no papers to sign, just the wind, the water, and the woman who had turned his entire world upside down. At night they lay side by side, talking in half-whispers, their words stitched together by touch and time. There were no declarations, only presence. In that silence, they built something stronger than any contract. For the first time, Malik wasn't a prince, he was just a man. And that was enough. Weeks turned into months. The world they had left behind continued spinning. Headlines speculated, royals scrambled, and the palace tried to spin the scandal into silence. But Malik and Soraya remained untouched. Their days were slow and full of color. Market mornings, long walks by the cliffs, shared meals under a crooked fig tree. Soraya found her rhythm in the local library, helping catalog old books in exchange for stories from passing travelers. Malik fished off the dock, not because he had to, but because he finally could. It wasn't perfect. They argued sometimes, about groceries, about how to fold towels, about nothing at all. But those arguments always ended with laughter, with kisses pressed into hair, with apologies whispered between sheets. One evening, as the sun dipped low and golden over the sea, Soraya placed his hand over her belly. No words, just the smallest curve of a smile. And in that moment, Malik knew everything they had risked, everything they had walked away from, had led to this. Not just freedom, but legacy. Chosen, not inherited. The day their daughter was born, the sky was overcast, and the sea was calm, like it too was holding its breath. Soraya labored in the small bedroom of their home, her cries muffled only by Malik's voice repeating, "You're not alone. I'm right here." And he was. When the baby arrived, dark-haired, wide-eyed, fists clenched like she already knew how to fight, the world shifted again. They named her Layla, hope, in a language both of them had lived and bled through. Malik held her in the crook of his arm, stunned silent by the weight of her, the heat, the heartbeat he could feel against his skin. Soraya, exhausted but glowing, watched them both through tears. "She has your eyes," she said. "But your courage," he replied. That night the three of them lay together, a family built not by decree, but by defiance, by love, and by the decision to begin again, on their own terms. Years passed, but the memory of their beginning never faded. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after Layla had fallen asleep, Malik would find himself staring out at the horizon, wondering what might have been if he'd chosen the crown. He didn't regret it, not truly, but the echoes of the palace still lived somewhere inside him. Soraya understood. She never asked him to forget. She only asked him to stay, and he did. They built a life layered with honesty, with late-night talks and early morning coffee, with scraped knees and lullabies. Layla grew fast, fierce, bright, curious. She asked questions Malik had no answers for and gave hugs that made him believe he didn't need any. In her eyes, he saw redemption. In Soraya's, he saw the home he never had in marble halls. And in himself, for the first time, he saw a man who was more than his name. They never returned to Darkash, not even when the monarchy fractured under pressure, not when new names took the throne, not when headlines called Malik a coward, a romantic, a rebel. He stopped caring what they called him the day Soraya took his last name, unofficially, unceremoniously, but with a smile that made it sacred. They kept their lives simple, anonymous, beautiful. Sometimes letters arrived from old friends, sealed with dusty wax and stamped with worry, but Malik never opened them. Whatever those envelopes held, it wasn't stronger than the quiet peace of their mornings or the sound of their daughter's laughter echoing in the garden. Power had never given him peace. Love had, and that was the story he chose to live. On a morning like any other, Malik sat on the porch with Layla curled against him, her curls wild from sleep, her thumb still hovering near her mouth. Soraya stepped outside with tea in hand, the sun catching the gold in her hair. She kissed the top of Layla's head, then his. "You know," Malik said, looking out toward the sea, "I still don't understand how it all happened." Soraya leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "Me neither," she whispered, "but I know this. Some storms don't come to destroy. They come to clear a path." He nodded, heart full, chest light. They didn't need answers. They had each other. And in that small, borrowed piece of the world, they had found everything they'd never been promised but dared to believe in. The kind of love you don't plan. The kind that rewrites the ending. If this story moved something in you, if it made your heart beat louder or your thoughts wander to someone unforgettable, subscribe to the channel. There's more where this came from.